All right, well, it's been a few weeks, and so I think last time Kayla shared, we went over the First Amendment, and so Benji, I think you're up, right? Second and Third Amendments. All right.
All right, so I'll start out with the Second Amendment. It is the right to bear arms. It states in the Constitution, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So it's like, should not be taken away. And I think this is a very big topic in today's world for sure, and one that is still being debated to be kept or not, because it's brought many benefits and many not so beneficial things in this world. But I think it's definitely nice to have that security and that freedom to, defend yourself against other things that may come up with a firearm. Yeah, but I think that we're like one of the last three countries that have the right today, and there was like 10 or 9 in the beginning, so it's kind of crazy how much they've limited stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's also in a way they're keeping it to make the government look good, because like if they kept weapons and we didn't have them, then it would seem unfair to us, right? And then that would make them look bad. But mainly I think that it's important for safety and of course the security of oneself. But yeah. And the Third Amendment is no soldier shall in the time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner nor in time of war, but in a manner too be prescribed by law. So saying that no soldier in time of peace can come into a civilian house and live for the time necessary. And I think you can't even be in someone's house even prescribed by law in a time of peace. But like, I think this one almost speaks for itself. Like, I don't think you're going to want a stranger living in your house just at any given time. But yeah, that's all I gathered.
Good. So what was the one thing maybe that you learned the most out of?
Second and the third.
Yeah.
What do you mean, like?
Something maybe you didn't know, or an interesting thought as you were researching it.
Well, I actually didn't know that soldiers could be quartered in people's houses in the war, so that was anything to me. Also, I wanted to say, they made this amendment, I think, because in the early 1700s, British soldiers were quartering people's houses and mistreating them or something like that. And so they made this amendment as part of the Bill of Rights to kind of stop it.
That's interesting.
Good. Yeah, well done. So let's examine them a little bit further. And so I think you hit all of the main topics there, the main talking points. And so we'll analyze them a little bit, but keeping in mind that as the framers are going through and talking about the rights of people, that were kind of piggybacking on other rights. And so you truly can't ever really look at any of these as separate from one another. And so this is kind of, again, an extension of freedom of expression, religion, speech, all of that. So those are the kind of the foundational, well, what would be the way that we would protect those rights? And that's really where we're getting into the Second Amendment. But if you will, let's open up to the Federalist Papers. I want to go through this. We're going to open up to Federalist 29. I think it's like let's see this one. 29. 60. Page 60. And so as we're kind of reading through this, and I know it's a little bit more dry reading, keeping in mind, as we talked about a little bit earlier, that the Federalist Papers were really designed kind of, in the modern sense, it would be like the influencers of today using TikTok, Facebook, whatever, trying to get a message out. it's pretty common practice now that elected officials use, TV, those sorts of mediums, right? Back then, they only had a printing press, right? There was no television, there was no apps on your phone, there were no phones. And so the way that you would control the narrative would be to print, and then to get the information out as much as possible. Now, keeping in mind as well that at the time the Federalist Papers were written, there was some pretty major opposition, right, in the form of Great Britain. And so America is still trying to pull away and establish itself. And so all of this stuff is kind of written at that time where we're pulling away, we're fighting a war, but now we're wanting to establish a new country. And the framers are trying to consider what it means to shape culture. And that's a pretty significant thing. And so as we're thinking about these amendments, what we're really talking about is the way that they saw to shape a modern culture. And if you're going to shape a culture, it needs to be something that can stand the test of time, correct? Right? Because it doesn't do much good for us to establish bedrock principles if we're only going to do it for a few years. And it keeps changing. And so, as we talked about before, the reason the Constitution was written in the way that it was written was so that things would evolve with wisdom and insight over a long period of time. All right, so Federalist number 29, concerning the militia, from the New York Packet, Wednesday, January 9th, 1788. All right, so this is a little bit older than some of you. This is Alexander Hamilton who wrote this particular one. To the people of the state of New York, the power of regulating the militia and of commanding its services in times of insurrection and invasion are natural incidents to the duties of superintending the common defense and of watching over the eternal peace of the Confederacy. So that's a whole lot of words. What does it mean? So as we're writing and thinking in terms of writing our essays, persuasive arguments. This is a declarative statement. It's a matter of fact. He's speaking from authority here, right? They're not offering up a, what do you guys think about this? It's not a, this might be, maybe this will help you out. He's speaking it as if it is absolute. And again, what are we talking about? Let's kind of break it down. What are we talking about when we talk about the militia? What do you think that means?
Military forces and stuff like that.
Yeah, military forces, but it's a very specific kind of military force. All right, so we'll take a step back. Let's say that we are being invaded back in those days by Great Britain. What is one thing that the country doesn't have established?
Leader.
They don't have a leader yet, right? And so they came up with a general. Who was the general?
George Washington.
George Washington, right? And so what was George Washington's role as general?
To lead them.
To lead who?
The militia.
Yeah, well, yeah. We made a continental army. And so the problem was, though, is that you had all of these, again, remember, individualized states that had their own thoughts and their own opinions on how things should work, right? You had a bunch of siblings who were fighting about whatever issue was before them. And so one of the problems with a large army, a continental army, is that where would you get its people from? You would have to pull them from all over the states. And if I'm from New Hampshire, am I going to want to follow somebody from Virginia, a general from Virginia? It's tricky. And so the concept of militias is not born out of the idea of one continental army. We actually still have militias today. We call them the National Guard. Each state has its own National Guard. Now, they are branches of the Army, so they fall under that category, but there is a real huge difference in the way that the National Guard is deployed versus the regular Army. The National Guard can only be deployed by a governor of a state. They cannot be deployed by a president. And there's reasons for that, okay? So again, as we've talked about, like, why we're building on these concepts here, we've talked about states' rights and how the states are separate from the federal government, right? Because ultimately we want to have a strong, powerful federal government, And we do have a strong federal armed forces unit, right? People voluntarily choose to go to the Air Force, the Army, the Marines, the Navy, and the Coast Guard is also considered part of that national defense. But what we're talking about here, very specifically, what they're getting at first is a well-regulated militia. And what that would mean for them is the power of the people to unite together, state by state, city by city. And so it's an important distinction to make. Because why would that be an important power for you and I to have as individuals? The power to organize a militia. Why would that be important for them? Let's think in terms of them now, because it's a lot harder to kind of think in terms of modern society. But why would that be important for them?
What was the question?
Okay, so why would it be important in the context of the revolutionary time for them to be able to put together militias and to have their own weapons available to them?
In case of a war breaking out near where wherever the city is, the town that is.
Well, why not just wait for the Continental Army?
It's not everybody can have that. And there are smaller towns that can't have, like, that are far away.
Yeah, they're further away, right? This is a time where there's not railroads running everywhere. There's no planes or whatever. And so if the Continental Army is in Washington, D.C., and you're in New York, and somebody attacks you, it doesn't matter. That battle is over, and you are now under the authority of whoever is the attacking party. And so you got to, again, we've got to consider the lay of the land here. How many of you think you're decent runners, like you can go long distance fairly well? How about hikers? How many of you are like, man, if I got to go more than 2 blocks, I'm just forget it. Yeah, right. But think about the difference between, so we drive from Forks to here, it's about an hour and 15-minute drive. Now imagine back then, I mean, and that's not too far away, right? In the modern understanding of Forks is not really a long ways away. I mean, it's a long drive if you don't drive it very often. It gets shorter when you do it more regularly, but it's not a long time. But if you have an army that needs to advance that far, it's not a matter of hours. It's a matter of days and days. And so as we're discussing this whole concept of our rights, the question comes up, and Benji kind of alluded to it. There's a lot of good things that come out of the Second Amendment and a lot of bad things. The problem with interpreting these amendments through a modern lens is they don't work. We cannot fit our understanding in modern times of what they were trying to apply. So most people who are in the judiciary will consider kind of the plain text and try to understand the plain text of what it meant and trying to understand what that looks like and then kind of bearing that out to modern day. So the argument about the Second Amendment is this. It's a pretty simple one. The question on one side is that whole idea of can't be taken away, right? Shall not be infringed, which is really clear language. I have the right to bear arms. It's clearly stated within the Constitution, correct? Well, many of the modern arguments against that would be, well, that was written at a time when guns were single shot, reload, single shot. Now we have guns that can fire multiple rounds per minute. So let's kind of put a pin in this, and we'll get back to the Federalist 29 here. So who would like to take the convincing side of why we should do away with the Second Amendment?
I will.
Okay. So why should we get rid of the right to keep and bear arms?
Because some people might take their rights too far and harm other people in the city or country, and especially if you have other people that are willing to help you. And because you don't have a limit, you should either set a limit or take it away.
So what would the limit be if we're going to limit now firearms? What's the limit?
2 guns.
2 guns.
Per house.
Okay. So I can have any 2 guns I want? What if my gun is a tank?
It's not a gun.
Come on. It fires things out of a long tube. It's the same as a gun. It's just a more high-powered gun.
Where would you get a tank from?
Tanks are us. I don't know. You can buy old World War II tanks. So I would just outfit it again. I know an engineer. I'll just refit it.
Where are you getting all
Benji,
that money
we're
from?
definitely going to Tanks R Us.
My pockets. So under your rule, two guns, I can use any kind of firearm. Or are you going to limit what kind of guns?
Because that's what would have to happen.
Right, and so if we're going to limit it to two weapons now, and then what are going to be the rules around those 2 weapons?
Only are allowed to use them in meeting, being able to meet. Only allowed to use them when needed or in danger.
So what does that mean? That's vague language. What if I think that I'm in danger because the person down the street gave me side eye? You know, Elijah's looking at me a little funny right now. I feel threatened.
Tanks R Us unleashed.
Does that mean that I get it?
Obviously, some people might need to get your brain checked. If that's the case.
All right. Okay, so I really appreciate your argument here, but stay focused on the argument. Okay? Good job. Yeah, it's a really hard position to take. It's a really hard position to argue in a modern society. Right? And this is the point, is that people will say, right, there's not a need. There's not a need for guns. And certainly not guns that shoot that many capacity. Right? And maybe that's true. But there's also plenty of people who use weapons for sport. And so another question we have to ask ourselves then is, well, who should we limit having access to weapons? Because there is constitutionally people who can't have weapons, right? And it says shall not be infringed. But who are the kinds of people that could not have weapons? Criminals. Right? And so you forfeit some of your rights, but criminals have to have very specific charges, right? Like you're not going to get your Second Amendment rights taken away for stealing a pack of gum, right? So you have to do something that rises to a certain threshold. Okay, so as we're thinking in terms of this, and the reasons that I'm bringing it up, and thank you, Kayla, for taking that very difficult position of trying to defend it. Is that when we think in terms of persuasive arguments, and again, with your guys' essays that we're working towards, what you want to think through as we formulate opinions on things is understanding both sides of the argument. It's easy to defend what I think and what I feel, particularly with something I'm passionate about, right? So it could be, you have people that argue about, is Ford or GMC better, right? Nike shoes or Reeboks. There's lots of things we can argue about, right? Is there anything specifically that you guys would feel passionate about, that you feel like this is the thing to get?
To buy?
Or the thing to buy, the thing to
iPhone.
have? iPhone. So why an iPhone?
I was going to say that.
Why an iPhone versus another phone?
Because they're just
Okay, so
Benji, that's what they all say. Buddy.
Yeah.
You got to give reasons.
so what? Yeah, why is the Android phone not better?
Yeah.
yeah, I think that.
I'm starting to be two-sided on that, actually. It's like some of the Androids have way better cameras.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I
But
guess it's just
Apple
my
has
personal
way
preference.
better display and function of
I
phone.
prefer the looks and the simplicity of iPhones.
Okay, good. So you got into I prefer. So what you were just arguing is a point of deference.
Mhm.
Did you see how you switched the argument?
Yeah.
Okay, so and this is good. It's a good conversation, and it's exactly the reason my hope in this class is more than just talking about the Constitution. Be declarative. Okay? The point of that, the discussion was to say why it was. And notice how you, and it's okay, it's a noble thing. You deferred. You looked for an opportunity to be deferent, to say, okay, well, that's just my preference, right? Now, again, the reason I'm bringing it up and pinning you on it is that was not the mentality of the framers or the revolutionaries. Why? Why were they not deferring? They had tried that already. It didn't work. But why were they not being, in what they were writing, deferent to a different opinion? Why were they being declarative and absolute?
Because they wanted people to take their side and agree with them.
Yeah. But even more than that, not just they
can
weren't
create a better union.
right. Yes, in order to form a more perfect union, right? And so a culture cannot be created by kind of being, double-minded. Kind of maybe what works for you. And again, when we're having interpersonal challenges, right? It's deference is good. Because we don't want to lose the relationship for the sake of whatever the argument is. But when it talks about establishing foundational principles, when it talks about framing something up, right? When we talk about like building a building, you don't want to be like, well, we did it wrong, but it should be okay. I don't want to hurt that person's feeling. They did all that work, they did totally wrong. We'll just throw some stuff up on it and it should be fine. No. Again, when we're thinking about debate and discussion and ideas, it is important to always understand and observe. But there also comes a time to be firmly rooted and secured in something that is true. Right now, this goes far beyond constitutional understanding. From a strictly American standpoint, patriotic, right? We want to be fully rooted in the ideals of what it means to be a good American. There's plenty of those people. But deeper than that, right? There's a culture that God is building in his house. There's structure that is in place. There are the things of the Lord that are not kind of, whatever. They're absolute. They're fixed. And so as we look at this too, I wanted to encourage you all not only to consider all sides of the argument, but to be established and rooted in confidence when you speak, when you debate, when anything, when you're writing. Be confident in what you're asserting. Own your voice. By the way, I see some of this in some of your writings. There is definite voice in your writings that is declarative. And there are at times when your voice kind of is questioning yourself whether you think it's true or not. What you'll notice as we're going through here and looking through the Federalist documents, one great way to write particularly declarative statements and persuasive arguments is to anticipate the argument of the person you're coming up against. So if I know the arguments, if I believe, and I do, that we all should have the right to bear arms, then I should be prepared to give a defense. The Bible talks about this. Be ready to give a defense for the hope that is in you. I should be able to give a defense of my opinions that are not rooted in my feelings, my preferences, my likes or dislikes, but they have to be rooted in something absolute. The reason we have a constitution is to create an absolute culture on which this union of we the people was to be built. And if the framers got wishy-washy about it, then, as Abraham Lincoln quoted the Bible in saying, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And so when they're talking about this idea of militia, I promise you I was on the rabbit trail. I'll bring it back. The militia was extremely important because, again, the militia represents the people and not the government. It wasn't the Continental Army that is represented in the militia. The militia is represented by people in counties, and states. And so what we would need out in Forks, if we were way back in those days, is not to depend on Port Angeles to come save us. It is that there is a people, a unified people in Forks. So if there was an invading army that stormed the beaches of Rialto, that there would be an opportunity for us to send out people on horsebacks, right? Horseback. One horse, one back. Multiple horses, they each have one back. That's what I meant to say. And so we see this, right? Like, you know, the midnight ride of Paul Revere. You guys know that story, remember? The redcoats are coming, the redcoats are coming.
Mm-hmm.
One if by land, two if by sea. That's the kind of the concept of what a militia was. The founding of our country and the revolutionary ideal was founded upon the idea of individuals banding together to fight. The reason we won the Revolutionary War was not because we had a great continental army. We didn't. Our army was miserable. It was a horrible army. It was cobbled together. I mean, thankfully, George Washington did a really phenomenal job with what he was given. But what made us successful was we had a bunch of misfits, militias, that while regular armies marched in line, down roads, you had all of these different people that were positioned all over the place, taking pot shots at officials in the armies of that time. In fact, a lot of what we understand now in the modern army, right? Like we wear, in the modern army, they wear camo, right? When they're out in the field, you know, people with higher ranks, they don't, you can't see their rank as visibly from far away. Like, if you've ever seen shows like Forrest Gump, is a good example of that. There's one point where some guys get to Vietnam and they begin to salute him, and he's all, don't do that. Why? Because he didn't want the attention on them. So one of the reasons we won the Revolutionary War is we knew how to take out those of higher rank, right? Because if you cut off the head of the snake, that's going to be a problem for them. So militias are really important to our founding. So how do we then compartment this into a culture of today? Why is it important? And Benji hit on this, is that it's got to go just beyond, right? The modern understanding can't simply just be, well, guns are bad because they shoot more people. We've got to kind of narrow that down of what is the intent to begin with. Well, first, the intent by the framers was for militia. If something were to happen, I should have every opportunity to band together with who? With like-minded individuals to keep at bay the enemy. Right? It's not permission for insurrection. In fact, that's kind of the debate right now. Is, well, the only reason you would need guns is for this purpose is to go up against the government. Well, that may be true. If the government becomes corrupt, that could be a time where that plays itself out. I doubt it, since the government has, control of tanks and helicopters and jets. But it was first for a militia, but second was, right, this idea of I have a personal right to secure my own property, my own family, and to protect them. And so understanding this right is, again, it's an extension of the freedom of expression I have as an individual. But then we need to have a sensibility to what does that look like and how does that affect the culture as a whole, right? Because it's perfectly okay if I own 1,000 guns. That might scare some people, right? If you came over to my house and I had a whole bunch of guns hanging out, that might not be the place you visited very often. And there's plenty of people that do that, who create militias of their own and have their own little possessions. But again, who do we limit having weapons? Well, we limit criminals. So this is kind of the argument where the best argument to kind of push back towards people is we have rights, right, as individuals, until we abuse those rights. Then our rights are limited. So a responsible person is who this is written for, correct?
Yeah.
Again, the intent of the author was to to speak to those who have some kind of like-mindedness, that this idea was for the betterment of everyone. And so why don't we strip rights from everyone because it hurts some? Well, in this case, there are just as many good reasons to defend ourselves as there are to say people could get hurt. And it's a worthwhile debate to have. All right, let's continue here. The power of regulating the militia. And so that's the important part there, right? It's not just the militia, but the power to regulate it. And commanding its services in times of insurrection and invasion are natural incidents to the duties of superintending the common defense and of watching over the internal peace of the Confederacy, right? So watching over the need for peace. And so this idea is that we need to be strong. We need to have weapons. We need to have a lot of them. Individuals need to have a right to all of them in order to keep the peace. So again, there's a very different mentality back then versus now. In fact, now most people are ambivalent when it comes to gun ownership or weapon ownership or fighting. Can you guys think of any scenario where you would become aggressive in fighting? Any scenario at all?
Well, if someone's trying to hurt you.
Somebody's trying to hurt you, self-defense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, or if someone was hurting someone you know.
Somebody you know. Yeah. Right. So defending others. So there is a time. What, did you do that? Did you beat somebody up? Did somebody went after somebody?
Yep.
They're all looking at you. What did you do?
Wait, they're
Elijah?
all looking at me?
What did you do, Elijah?
I mean, no. I mean, that's never... I've
No,
beat
I
people
used to
up
be
before,
protective over
but
you
not
when I
because
was
of that.
younger.
When you were younger, not now.
Used to.
Not now. He's all
He's still-
ham. She's on her own now. She
Actually,
can fight
there's
her
been
own
many times where Noah has like saved me from things or like, protected me.
Heck saves everyone.
Many times.
Get
Right. And and those are noble. Right. Again, these rights that are noble and pure, and the understanding of it is for a more perfect union, right? To protect my sister, to protect my family, to protect those I love, to protect my country. Those are all really good and noble things. And so, yeah, the idea of this, again, is born out of this. There is an inherent right to do what is good. That's what the rights are endowed for us for. When we talk about that in the preamble, right, that we, the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, those things are built upon really high ideals. So properly understood, all of these things come from a framework of how is this going to benefit mankind. So laws are written for people who follow laws. Laws are generally not written for people who break them, because they'll break them anyways. So the question then would be, how do we, the people who are going to follow the laws, how are we going to honor them and uphold them? All right. It requires no skill in the science of war to discern the uniformity in the organization and discipline of the militia would be attended with the most beneficial effects whenever they were called into service for the public defense. It would enable them to discharge the duties of the camp and of the field with mutual intelligence and concert an advantage of peculiar moment in the operations of an army, and it would fit them much sooner to acquire the degree of proficiency in military functions, which would be essential to their usefulness. Is anyone following along? Or are you just like, what is going on? And so, again, the heart of this is that not only do we have a militia, but the militia begins to meet together, to learn together on how they advance, how you retreat, how you even fire, right? Because at that time, you're like teaching little kids, like, this is how you aim a gun, and this is how you discharge a gun, and this is how you handle a gun, and this is, you never point out, like one of the conversations we were having with some of the younger boys, even today, in playing with their toy guns, is that you even treat toy guns as if they're weapons that have a bullet in them, and that we don't point even toy guns around. And there's a mindset and an attitude around this, right? And that's what they're talking about here, is that it would be really beneficial to us as a country if we had all of these really well-regulated militias where they have learned how to properly maintain their weapon, how to discharge their weapon, to have some form of understanding of tactics, right? You guys played some of you played laser tag? Did you guys play in teams?
Mm.
Did you have like some strategy involved, or did you just send one person out to get shot at, or did you just all scatter and do your own thing?
We had strategy in one of the last rounds.
Yeah.
I don't
So
know.
which works better, having a little bit of strategy, or just kind of everyone doing their own thing?
Strategy.
Well, strategy, right? Right. Like there's whole lessons that are taught in college, military strategy and tactics. And they're really important. There's a old book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu that a lot of modern understanding of military tactics are born out of, in understanding the enemy and understanding the enemy's mindset. And so again, we're kind of looking at this Federalist paper of he's putting forward this really clever argument of saying this is really beneficial for us. Like if we want to be safe, you know, like if you want to be safe where you're at, wouldn't you want your neighbor to know how to discharge a gun and keep you, like if they were the first line of defense, like you would want them to know. Or if you're going to have to retreat back to their place, you would want somebody who had weapons, like if you lost yours. And so again, they're taking these arguments and they're thinking clearly about what are the drawbacks, what are the things that could happen to us, what are some arguments that might be made, and we're beginning to poke holes in the argument before somebody can make an argument. Right? Have you ever talked to somebody and they're already in their head, they're already making their defense, right? And they're not listening, and well, a persuasive argument is meant to give them no opportunity to say but, and that's what's happening here. This desirable uniformity can only be accomplished by confiding the regulation of the militia to the direction of the national authority. It is therefore with the most evident propriety that the plan of the convention proposes to empower the Union to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress. All right, so now what does that mean? Is that we're going to have rules, though, about how the militia operates. And so the federal government is going to control kind of the how do we do things, and what is the order of things, and what is the culture around now the idea of militias. And so now we have a national culture, right? The federal government. We have a state culture. We have an individual culture, and we now have a militia culture. So everything that they're building is in this concept of culture, top-down culture. But it's all supported under the idea of the Constitution. And so what they have observed rightly here is going, though, if we're going to control it from Washington, D.C., and again, we're going to tell New Hampshire, Delaware, you know, how they need to do things, it would benefit us if we gave them power to determine who their officers were. And so again, this could be looked at as concession, right? Like trying to find a way. But again, he doesn't speak with like I'm conceding something to them. What he's done in his argument is he doesn't make a concession. Why? Because it's his argument. So he anticipating kind of the pushback that would happen was saying, what we'll do is it needs to be your guys' rights to be able to appoint a leader. Well, what that did is it diffuses the arguments from those who were probably ready to say we shouldn't have a national army, we should have a state army, and it should be my guy who's in charge, not your guy in charge. Well, anticipating that argument, what did he do? He took the legs out from that argument completely. Now, how does that invite you in, if you're somebody who is thinking that, how does that invite you into that conversation? Well, all of a sudden, Hamilton here has presented for me an argument on my behalf. He's included. He's thought about me. Now this begins to shift mindsets. This is how you shape culture, right? Shaping culture means getting agreement, but most people don't understand what they think or feel about anything, right? We live in a culture, in a society that currently just is whatever happens in the moment. We just say what out of our emotion. There's not a lot, generally speaking, politically when we look at this, there's not a lot of logic put forth. There's not a lot of understanding both sides of the argument, right? There's a really rigid adherence to whatever I believe. Think about this in terms of, have you guys ever had to learn something new? And you were convinced that the way you did it was the right way? That's childhood. That's growing up. But as you become an adult, right, that's a whole different thing. It's a transition to ownership. You go from a mentality of somebody else is stewarding my life to now I'm a steward of my own life, to then having kids where now you're a steward of other lives. And as a good steward, your job or a good leader is to lead people to do what? To just follow what you say, or have them learn inherently to lead themselves. Which is a better way? For me to tell you what you have to do, or for you to learn what is right?
Whatever is right.
But there's got to be a common standard. And this is, again, what Hamilton is arguing for. And I'm not going to go into all of it. I just wanted to give you guys a brief kind of understanding. And I get that the verbiage here and the language is different. And so, again, where I would encourage you and challenge you as you think about these essays that we're going to be writing, and I think I give you two options of titles. And the content of it is really, there's a lot of freedom to write. But I want you to take this mindset of, we live in a culture that not a lot of people understand the Constitution, know the Constitution, care about the Constitution. So I want you to write it in the same way that the Federalist Papers were written, to be a declarative, persuasive argument. And so what we're looking for is authority. And so when you're writing this essay, just to help you out, it won't be what I think is a good idea. It's not. There's no I thinks in here. It's capitals, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers. Again, anticipating how somebody might argue against this. And so what you have to first do is you have to ask yourself, when it comes to either the topic of we the people or the title of A More Perfect Union, is what is the point I'm trying to make? And it could be one specific thing. You could say, I want to talk about the freedom of speech. I want that to be, I'm going to convince people why it's so important to have the freedom of speech. It could be, I want to talk to people about how to shape a culture and what that looks like. Whatever you choose, right? The central argument that you make, you have to speak with authority. Because the goal of this is to convince me. And what I'll do is I'm going to take the role of somebody who isn't convinced. This is an old, outdated document that means nothing. And so when you're writing this, and when you're trying to come to an understanding of how do I make these statements, first, come up with your point that you're trying to make. Second, I want you to analyze that from the negative standpoint. Is who could poke holes in this argument? So you could write out that first declarative statement, and then you could say, all right, I'm going to be critical about this and say, where are the holes in that argument? Where could somebody say, nope, I don't see it? And this is why, we have Kayla today at least talk about the Second Amendment, pushing back against that, and why we have to limit things. I mean, there's a lot of debate, right? Should we limit guns? Should we limit the capacity of magazines? They talk about bump stocks, things that you add to a gun. And there's all sorts of people, by the way, that ignorantly think that they know what they're saying. If we just take away that, we'll solve the problem, and it doesn't. And it's because we've become a culture that's more interested in saying what I think instead of understanding the other person's argument. Moving on to, we had another amendment, right? Should probably talk about that. And so quartering soldiers. Again, why was that important? Because back then, your house would get taken over. We saw this happen again in American history during the Civil War, where complete farms were taken over by different armies. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Southerners hated those from the Union, because when the Union Army went down, they were starving. And so what did they do? They killed old Farmer John's pig, and they cooked it up, and that was Farmer John's favorite pig. And so originally born out of that idea, again, is personal autonomy away from the government. And the two work hand in hand. Second and Third Amendments work hand in hand. Why? Because we don't want a militia or an army to come in and take over. Right? That's not okay. That's not healthy, because there has to be a balance between the power of the federal government and the power of the individual. But what it clearly gives is if I as an individual want that army or that warring party to win, and I invite them in, they're absolutely welcome. And so again, there's this, and really the funny part about it is that the Third Amendment we don't really use a lot. I mean, it's not really something that comes up in debate, right? It's kind of a throwaway. We don't really think about it at all. But what it highlights for us, and why it's so significant as well for us and our understanding is it highlights the balance between the individual rights and the rights of the state and the rights of the federal government, and how those play off of one another. Because again, at the heart of the Constitution, there's this idea of we, the people. The Third Amendment highlights individual rights above the rights of the federal government to just come in and take over. Now, that's pretty significant because, again, think in terms of, like, now, no big deal, right? But back then, this would have been a major thing, because chances are pretty likely that if there was fighting breaking out, the fighting is going to break out close to where people lived, because they were utterly dependent upon the supply chain, right? From whatever, in particular England, from wherever harbor they landed their ships, they had to conquer and make sure that they controlled the roads going in and out. And so, again, why would this be important for the idea of defense? It would be really good for the individual family to be able to protect itself. But it is in the great interest of our neighbors and their neighbors if that family has the ability to be sovereign over their own land and to not give way. Because if somebody just comes in and takes it, right, can take it whenever, that certainly affects you if you're getting taken over, but it affects everyone around them. And so again, baked into all of the Constitution is this idea of what I do as an individual affects the culture around me. And the perfect ideal of the way that things are set up is there's the individual, then there's a local government, right? There's the people of Forks, the people of Port Angeles, all of that, and then there's the state. So we're getting a little bit bigger, and that's representative of each individual county, city, and then there's the idea of the federal government. And so again, we have to get back to this understanding of how is a culture built? A culture built properly has at the top of it a federal understanding, a framework, a foundation that is collective to all. That's what we see in the Constitution. But the way that it is built is for the sake of the individual to be endowed with those rights, to understand those rights, to internalize those rights, and then to take ownership over those rights. Because if I take ownership over those rights, and I'm convinced of those rights, the likelihood is then I'm going to be a mouthpiece, whether I say anything or not, right? I'm going to be an example. I'm going to live by that. So properly understood, right, you would know those who were with America and those who weren't, more than based on what they said. In the same way, when we're walking in faith, in a culture, in a community, and we've talked about this a lot in our meetings, right? Have you noticed the language has been a lot about it's a way of life, it's a way of living. It's not what we say, it is how we are living out those realities and those principles and those truths. But those rights, the will and the way to do things don't come from the individual. Right? Our faith is not our own in the sense that we don't get to just pick and choose. We might, that doesn't end well for us. There has to be some foundation to build off of. There has to be a collective understanding. And so what we see constitutionally is there's, again, that interplay between my rights as an individual, my rights as a member of the group, and how I relate, right? Because that's the most important thing in a culture is the way that we relate, right? So the way that I relate to Kayla as her dad, the way I relate to Nicole, she's my wife, right? The way that I relate to you guys is a little bit different. And so each of those takes on unique, different roles, responsibilities. But then I have a right or a relationship to the community as a whole, and playing my part in it, right? Being a member of the body. I think Tim was talking about that last week, right? Like not complaining about if you're like the foot, you want to lift the food. Well, no, you're the foot. You're the big toe in the kingdom. And being happy with that. There's a role and a responsibility to play because each member is designed to do what? To serve the greater community. We, the people, in order to what? To form a more perfect union. And so rightly understood again, we keep saying this over and over again, but the Constitution needs to be understood as culture building. And the question you have to ask yourselves, you might have to ask yourselves is why does this even matter? Does any of this matter to you? The reason I would encourage you to, even if you're skeptical, so I'm sure some of you are like, I don't want to forget this. There may come a time in your life where having a firm stance on these things will matter. Deeper than that, I will say, the culture that is being built amongst our people, there is definitively and without question a time that is coming and is here now where you have to answer where you stand on the matter. And I would encourage you to take that stance with authority, not an authority that comes from within, from our opinions, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, right? Because those things change like the weather. But to be declarative from a broader understanding of foundation and framework. For the individual in the late 1700s in America, the choice was really simple. Do I side with Great Britain and alienate all of those around me here? Or do I side with this new people, this new nation, and face the wrath of Great Britain? It was a very real discussion. There was no kind of on the fence. You didn't get to be, there's no Switzerland there. You were either a Tory, which would have been loyal to the king and the crown, or you would have been a revolutionary or a rebel. There was no opting out of that choice. So what Hamilton, John Jay, what they were arguing for was a rallying cry of why we the people should be unified. And they made an allowance for the fact that they weren't perfect by saying what we're going to create here is a more perfect union, is something that can be strived for, something that can be considered. And again, the way that should play itself out for us today in our community, amongst God's people as individuals is considering how does our individual relationships one to another, how are those impacted by the way that I act, the things that I believe, the things that I say? Am I flippant in my words, or am I intentional? Do I make commitments and follow through with them, or am I wishy-washy? And I think the honest answer is sometimes we can be both of those things. Sometimes we can be very convicted and do the right things, and at times we fall short. But again, what's the most important part of culture building? It's relationship. But there's a framework, proper framework. And so as you're presenting to me and Noah and Emmanuel and the rest of the community, who knows, your declarative statements and your persuasive arguments, I just encourage you to own it. If you get to the point where you're just like, this is not important to me, I can't wholeheartedly write an essay, that would be an honest place to just come and have a conversation about then what's the alternative. Because quite honestly, I don't have a heart to assign you an essay that's going to be a throwaway essay, and I'm going to be super critical on it. And I'm going to intentionally, and so again, when we hand them in, you're going to present orally, and then you're going to get debate. I'm doing that for a reason. It's not to see you guys fail. It really is kind of an exercise in holding conviction. So if you can't be fully sold on it, let's find an alternative. Because the goal of it is for you guys to speak with boldness and clarity and conviction, but doing so in a way that has considered all points of view and all sides of it. Because this world is not lacking in people who have opinions. Sadly, the majority of people's opinions are uninformed. And what you'll find even with informed opinions is that sometimes you'll disagree. So how do we resolve that when that happens? We could be deferent, right? And that's a good way to do it. Sometimes we talked about this a little bit earlier on, right? The idea of compromise, right? There's 3 different forms of compromise. Do you remember what were the 3 forms of compromise? Benji wasn't here, he's off the hook.
Yeah, likely.
He's like, wait a minute. Go. Well, there's compromise where we give in to one another and we look for opportunities to give a little bit both ways. There's compromise where I become an authoritarian and tell you what's going to do, and what I do is I compromise you in that process. Or there's where we just, don't have a voice at all and we just cower down and we compromise our own integrity and we just give way to whatever. There is a way to have healthy compromise, right? In the idea of culture or community. And that is by having a voice. But again, the voice has to be attached to something. So when you write it, right, it's we the people. It's a more perfect union. And you're going to convince and compel. And so if I'm going to convince you, I'm not going to be passive about it. At all, am I? When I say passive means I'm not going to kind of make an argument. Well, is this okay? It's okay if I talk to you guys real quick about it? It's not going to be a quiet voice. When you read, and I would encourage you to read through some of this. They're not timid. And I know for some of you, your temperaments lean towards quiet, laid back. We're going to see that kind of press through that a little bit. Be authoritative. Because you can be timid and quiet, but have authority in who you are and what you believe in your convictions. And ultimately, that's the hope of what this class is about, is holding our convictions and understanding the world around us and interpreting it through a lens of foundation. We just happen to be framing it in the thought of American history. All right, that's it. Any thoughts or questions before we conclude here? I'm sure Esther has something to say. She looks like she's got something powerful to say. No, nothing. All right, good job today, Benji.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Let's see. Next week, we should probably assign somebody next week. Does any volunteers want to take the? Let's see. What amendments should we do next week? So I may not go through every one of them. Let's see. Search and seizure. That's a good one. So 4, 5, 6, and 7 for next week. Who wants to do 4, 5, 6, and 7? And again, it doesn't have to be really in depth.
Oh,
I'm gonna do it. Your aunt's in town next week, so.
just kidding.
All right, that means I'm gonna do it, and I'm gonna give then Elijah the next week a harder one to do. And you're not gonna be able to prepare for it now because I'm not giving you 2 weeks. All right, that's it. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Justin.